Good morning and welcome to Zhichankar's virtual seminar series on mental flourishing, scientific and practical views on emotions and mind training. This series is organized by the Center for Bhutan and G&H Studies in collaboration with the International Society for Bhutan Studies. This seminar series, which this is the last, has facilitated the exchange of various different views and approaches to achieving mental flourishing. CBS seeks to engage with various different actors and experts to encourage interdisciplinary dialogue on training one's mind and emotions. The theme of mental flourishing is most important given that the globalized world is constantly overwhelming us with information and content available to us at the touch of a button on our smartphones, laptops, and more. Furthermore, with lockdowns and limited socializing, we are in a unique time where practicing introspection and understanding ourselves is vital. Before I start introducing our very esteemed moderator, I would like to express a personal vote of thanks to the rest of the CBS team, as this is our last session working together. I am extremely grateful to Dashakarma Ura and Dr. Sabina for giving me the wonderful opportunity to work with the center and contribute in my own small way. This experience has been eye-opening and illuminating the incredible initiatives and work that the center is doing. And this seminar series would not have been possible without the support of my fellow colleagues, Pemdem, Putu, and Dashiden, who have been integral in ensuring its success. So from my side, deepest thank you and Ganchela. And I'm going to move on to introducing our esteemed moderator. We are thrilled to have Mr. Chencho today, Director of the Office of the Prime Minister, moderate the session. Mr. Chencho is a brilliant and dynamic civil servant who has served in the Gross National Happiness Commission for the past 2 decades. His career as a civil servant began in 2003 after the successful completion of his undergraduate degree in information technology from Sharapsi College, Kangwon. He completed his master's in information systems from RMIT University in Australia. And his professional interests lie in research and the implementation of governance systems, performance management systems, and data and information management systems. So thus, the CBS team is honored to welcome such a remarkable civil servant, and we greatly anticipate this exchange. Mr. Chencho, the floor is yours, La.
Good afternoon and Kuzambola. And thank you for the introduction, Mizin. Good afternoon and welcome to the 10th virtual seminar series on mental flourishing, views from science and practical views on emotions and mind training, presented by the Center for Bhutan and GNA Studies with the International Society for Bhutan Studies. This seminar series has thus far engaged numerous eminent field leaders whose research work addresses issues that touch us all, from unwinding anxiety with Jude Brewer to Richard Davison on the brain and emotions, excuse me, sorry, to Kim Samuel on social connectedness, Barbara Fredrickson on positive emotions, and on leading from the emerging future from ecosystem to ecosystem economics with Dr. Otto Sharma. In Bhutan, His Majesty the King's recent royal decree on education reforms emphasizes values education, including mind training. That is important not only for students, but also for many young people in Bhutan, because the burden of unemployment, uncertainty of their future, and also many other social and economic dynamics coupled by technological developments have inadvertently and unfortunately triggered mental stress and have had also led to depression. In Bhutan, although there is high degree of awareness on mental health issues and efforts to fight the stigma, but practical tools to fight depression, such as mindfulness and the scientific studies that Professor Kuyken leads, are not that well known in Bhutan. Therefore, to address this vital issue of mental health. Today, I'm very delighted to moderate the seminar on preventing depression across the lifespan with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which from here on I would like to refer as MBCT, with Professor Willem Kuyken. So please let me allow some time to at least provide a brief summary of the the profile of the very illustrious career that Professor William Kuyken has had. Professor Kuyken focuses on depression and evidence-based approaches to depression. In particular, his research examines how mindfulness and mindfulness-based programs can prevent depression and enhance human potential across their lifespan. Several studies have arisen out of his work that suggest mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, as an alternative to normal medication measures of antidepressants, as well as adopting MBCT as a universal approach to preventing depression in adolescents. These suggestions have been published in some of the world's top knowledge resources, such as the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, the Lancet, British Journal of Psychiatry, etc. Professor is also interested in the interface of ancient wisdom traditions and contemporary science. Professor's book titled The Mindfulness Ancient Wisdom Meets Modern Psychology is published by the Guildford Press. Professor has also co-authored the books, namely Compassion in the Landscape of Suffering and Collaborative Case Conceptualization, Working Effectively with Clients in Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Like any compassionate and learned teacher, Professor also has supervised and mentored more than 40 graduate students, many of whom have gone on to productive careers in research, teaching, and are doing great service in the health sector to the population of the world. His research has been supported by the National Institute of Health Research, Wellcome Trust, Economic and Social Research Council, the NHS, Oxford Mindfulness Foundation, to name a few. Also, Professor regularly gives keynotes and workshops like today on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and compassion for a range of organizations. These have included, amongst others, national associations, public and third sector organizations, as well as policy and governmental groups. He has also been covered in numerous media outlets, including the CBS, New Statesman, The Telegraph, The Guardian, BBC, among many others. Professor earned his PhD from the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London, and doctorate in clinical psychology from the Solomon Clinical Psychology Training Program. From 1999 to 2014, Professor worked at the University of Exeter, where he held a number of roles, including heading up the doctoral clinical psychology training program and also leading the clinical research group. During his time in Exeter, he co-founded the Moods Disorder Center and also co-founded the Masters in Mindfulness-Based Cognitive Therapies. Since 2014, Professor has been director of the Oxford Mindfulness Center. For all that the esteemed speaker, Professor William, has done thus far, Professor was awarded the May Davison Award for making outstanding contribution to the development of clinical psychology within the first 10 years of his work as a qualified clinical psychologist. Therefore, today we are very delighted to host such a celebrated author and a world-renowned personality. Professor Kuyken, we look forward to a very engaging presentation from you. And as a token of respect, I can only promise, I hope it's okay on behalf of all the audience here, to offer our highest possible level of mindfulness to your talk. So with this, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. And it is a great privilege to be part of this series and to be the last speaker in, as you noted, a very esteemed set of speakers. And thank you for that very generous and fulsome introduction, Mr. Chencho. I feel very honored to be speaking to you all about something that's very close to my heart, the prevention of depression across the lifespan, and also to a group of people in a country that has provided leadership to the world around the prioritization of human capital, human flourishing, human potential, human well-being, in the much lauded phrase, gross national happiness. I wonder if in the next 100 years, this will become more of the norm, whereas at the moment, you provide more solo leadership in that sense. I also want to just acknowledge the center that has put up this set of seminars and what that represents, which I understand is a very strong and historical link, including with the leadership in Bhutan, between Bhutan and the University of Oxford. The University of Oxford is the oldest English-speaking university in the world, and often ranked to be one of the leading universities in the world. And I feel very, very privileged to be part of that university that has shown leadership just recently in the development of a vaccine that is being rolled out around the world at cost by our vaccine group here and its partners, AstraZeneca. So what I'll do now, if I can, is just share some slides. My intention is to speak for probably no more than 30 minutes. And that's because I think probably what will be most fruitful is dialogue. And I love the word dialogue because my understanding of it in its Greek origins is dia means between two people and logos means meaning. So it's the creation of meaning between two sets of people, myself and the knowledge that I'm going to try to touch on in my presentation and the context within which you all are thinking and working. So let me just share my screen. Has that come through okay? Can you see that okay?
Yes, sir.
Brilliant. So what I would like to do is to talk about depression and say just a little bit about what I believe the challenge to be. And then at a very kind of top level, if you like, some of the ways in which I think we need to be responding before I get specifically into all of the work that we've done around mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which we have shortened as MBCT. And then I want to just end up by broadening out a little bit to the broader challenges around mental health and where I see things going in the next little while. But I want to just start here with my colleague, Christina Feldman, and Mr. Chencho referred to this book. But I put this up for the very simple reason that Christina Feldman is my co-author on this book. And Christina Feldman is an extraordinary woman. Her education involved as a teenager. She's, I think, in her early 60s now, so 45, 50 years ago, heading to Dharamsala. A very brave thing to do back then. And she was one of the first people to have been taught by Westerners, to be taught by the Dalai Lama. And she went on and continued her education, which was an education in the Dharma, in a number of different other settings before coming back to the UK and alongside others in Europe and America, finding a way of teaching what she had learned in a way that could be accessible to the people that she was teaching, which were the people here in the UK and her colleagues in the US and her colleagues in Europe. And then when about 20 years ago, a group of people, including myself, started researching mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, she said there's a lot of potential synergy here. And I reached out to her and said, would she come and teach on a master's program that I was developing on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy? And would she teach a module on Buddhist psychology? And she said something very interesting. She said, no, I won't do that. I'm not interested in doing that. What I'd like to do is to teach with you on the content of the human mind and the way in which the human mind can create suffering and the way in which human mind can create flourishing, joy, and happiness. And why don't we together see if we can generate a synergy between what I understand from my own practice, my own mindfulness practice, my own education in Asia, my own teaching over decades, and what you know from your practice and your science. And initially it was a bit like she was playing the piano and I was playing the saxophone. And there was some discordance in the early days. But over time, she would just pick up my saxophone and I would pick up her piano, and it became much more of a seamless teaching. And in this book, what we've tried to do is to capture that seamlessness of essentially charting a map of the human mind and the way in which it can create happiness or suffering, and the way in which it can be trained, drawing on the very best psychological science and the very best ancient wisdom, Buddhist psychology, hence the name. So it feels wonderful to be here with you all, because as I understand the brief that I've been given and having watched some of the other talks, that is the challenge in two directions, both for you in Bhutan and for us also in countries like the UK, where we are trying to find a way of drawing together the very best ancient wisdom, contemplative traditions, which after all have helped people for thousands of years, with what we're learning from neuroscience, from social psychology, and from other psychological science. But let me start by saying something about depression. Why is this so very, very important? Well, the World Health Organization estimates that between 200 and 300 million people around the world right now are suffering from depression. In a 2017 report, they estimated that some 20,000 people in Bhutan might be suffering from depression. If you look at the life course of depression, you can then begin to project that maybe 1 billion people in the world, of the world's population, will at some point in their lives suffer from depression. That's an enormous number of people. That creates an enormous public health challenge. Not just the human suffering of depression, but the disability adjusted life years that creates, the impact on the economy that creates, that the loss of human capital and human potential that creates. So what does our response need to look like? By the way, I'm going to be in my presentation be painting with a very broad brush, partly because of the audience and partly because of the amount of ground that I want to cover. But what I've done is I've put on all of the slides, which will be freely circulated. You'll see in the bottom right-hand corner web links to all the papers that I'm drawing on, most of which are open access. So if you want to dig into the detail of anything I'm saying, I've tried to provide references so that you can do that if you're interested. The first thing I think I want to say about a response to this enormous public health challenge is that we know now quite a lot about depression and its treatment. And I think the first thing that we know is that there is no doubt that depression is a psychosocial problem. So from the outside in, things like inequality, diet, deprivation, adversity in people's upbringing. These are all influence depression. At a social level, loneliness, conflict, trauma, discord, all influence depression. And at a psychological level, things like the way we think, the way we behave influence depression. And at a biological level, the endocrine system, genetics, even epigenetics have been shown to influence depression. So the first thing I want to say is depression is a biopsychosocial problem. There is not going to be one magic bullet at one of those levels. It's going to require thinking at all of those levels. The second thing I want to say is that we know quite a lot about the typical life course of depression. Typically, modally, depression will begin in late adolescence or early adulthood with a sort of flurry of anxiety or low-grade depressive symptoms. So what we've got on the y-axis here is this is mental health and flourishing up here. This is greater depressive symptoms. This is full-blown depression. And you'll see in late adolescence, early adulthood, a flurry. And then possibly in early adulthood, late adolescence, a first episode of depression. Now, what's very interesting about depression is that some 50% of people who have one episode of depression will go on to have subsequent episodes. If people have 2 or 3, you're looking at 70, 90% of relapse and recurrent rates, so that people are into a pattern of chronicity. And at that point, this is a group of people for whom depression becomes a bit like a chronic illness, like diabetes, so that they are managing in a more long-term way. And this is, I think, the kind of depression that is a real challenge for health services and mental health services, because people are now into a relapsing course of depression. So I want to just back up and say something about the treatment of depression. Treatment is really just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, I'm just going to, no, it's okay. I'll do it this way. Treatment is just the tip of the iceberg. And in fact, in that WHO report, where they estimated that 20,000 people in Bhutan might be suffering depression, they estimated that only 1,000 of those were accessing some kind of treatment. And that is true the world over, different degrees in different countries, of course. But the typical treatments are antidepressant treatment or psychological treatments. But the next way that one might get into the prevention of depression is through what is called, beyond treatment, is called indicated prevention. And what that means is identifying the people who are at risk for depressive relapse or at risk for depression, and treating those or offering something to that group of people. And that is where mindfulness-based cognitive therapy comes in. So it takes these folks who have got a history of depression and says, you are at very high risk of a long-term course of depression. And can we teach you some skills to prevent depression from coming back in the long term? And that's where this approach called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy comes in. It's a group-based approach taught by a skilled teacher to groups of about 15 people over 8 weeks. And it's based on the best psychological science, and it's based on wisdom traditions, and it uses meditative mindfulness practices to help people to first understand their minds and then to retrain their minds. And we now know quite a lot about mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. And I'm, again, with quite a broad brush, I'm going to overview some of that work. So the first question you might ask is, does it work? So this is a piece of work that we published in JAMA Psychiatry. And again, for those of you who are scientists, this will look familiar. For those of you who aren't, I will unpack it at quite a top level. Basically, the gold standard in health research are randomized controlled trials. And there have now been at least 10 randomized controlled trials, and we accessed all the data from those trials. and we analyzed it together to ask the question, is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy effective? And this is called a forest plot. It isn't necessary to understand all of the background or the detail, but essentially what I would do is just point you to the bottom line, which is the overall effect from all of these trials. And this line here is the line at which, if it didn't work, you would see this triangle, which is the data from all the trials, sitting here. And if it was actually dangerous or harmful, it would sit on this side of the line. And what you see is a triangle that is very clearly on this side of the line, which tells us that with no margin of error, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is more effective at preventing depression than the comparators in all of these trials, gold standard trials. So we have an effective intervention against these comparators. And you might recall that I said the main way in which depression is currently treated is with antidepressants. So we asked in this trial published in the Lancet, how does this compare with people staying on their antidepressant medication? And we asked about 500 people to enter this trial, and half of them learned the meditation practices, the cognitive behavioral practices, and came off their medication, and the other half stayed on their medication, which we know is an effective way to help people stay well. And what we found in this trial was that mindfulness-based cognitive therapy looks very comparable in terms of people staying well over a 2-year follow-up. And it wasn't conclusive, so we included this in the meta-analysis I was just talking about, the pooled effects. And so there were actually 3 other trials comparing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy with antidepressant treatment. This is this bottom slide here, MBCT versus antidepressants. And what we see here is the same triangle on the same side of the line, suggesting this really interesting possibility. For the probably tens of millions of people around the world who are on antidepressants, who would like to find a different way of staying well in the long term, MBCT provides an alternative, which is incredibly heartening and encouraging. And we have started to now think, how do we get this into practice? How do we get this into the real world, which is, I guess, the inquiry that you are engaged with as well in your healthcare system. And the first thing we did was we asked, well, this is randomized controlled trials, and people sometimes say, you know, this is gold standard, and what does it look like in the real world? So we went and looked in the real world at the data. And again, I'm not going to get into the numbers, but what the numbers recommend or suggest, and you can go and find the paper for yourself, is that actually the effects are comparable in the real world that they are in randomized controlled trials. So in the real world here, this is UK data in National Health Service settings. We see similar effects on depression and on well-being and on risk for depression in real-world healthcare settings. And that has led us to start to train people around the world. So here at the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, we've worked with others to develop a model for training MBCT therapists. We've published that, made it freely available online. We have been to countries, not to Bhutan, but we've been to your neighboring countries, China on a number of occasions. So this photograph here is us teaching in, that was in Shanghai. This was us teaching in, I believe this was Taiwan. This was us teaching in the United Arab Emirates, and we have been teaching also in India. So the first thing is to disseminate this work so that it becomes more widely available. And we have also done quite a lot of policy work, trying to assimilate the evidence, work with policymakers. And this was a report here in the UK, which I think has been now replicated in a number of other countries. And MBCT is now recommended as an approach to the prevention of depression in clinical guidelines in numerous countries around the world. So to summarize, while MBCT is not a panacea, it does clearly offer those with a substantial history of depression a new approach to learning skills that can help them to stay well in the long term. And I want to tell you about some of the kind of more preliminary work in other areas. So if we think about kind of this iceberg of treatment being at the top, and then prevention being working with a much larger population of people that we can help potentially. The next population of people that we might try and help is those who've got symptoms of depression but haven't yet had a depressive episode in late adolescence. And we, in a program of work led by Tamsin Ford, are beginning to explore mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for young people and their carers. And we are doing that work at the moment, but we have demonstrated that it's acceptable and it is promising both for the young people and their parents who are in groups alongside them as well. These are ancient approaches, modernized to help people to understand how these early symptoms of depression might potentially manifest into depression. And some people find this helpful, and we hope to do this on a larger scale in time. So Richie Davidson, actually, who I think was one of the speakers in an earlier part of the series, wrote a commentary on the meta-analysis that I described earlier, my meta-analysis earlier. And one of the things he said was, this is great, this is fantastic, but the next stage of work needs to ask, how does this work? If we can understand how it works, that can help us to offer it more effectively. So we are doing a lot of work on that question of what is it we're actually teaching people? What are the skills that we're actually teaching people? And I love this book, I Had a Black Dog. It's on the World Health Organization website. I think it's been viewed tens of millions of times now. It's written by somebody who suffered from depression, and he just describes the experience so very, very powerfully. I think it's got translations into many different countries, languages as well. And this, I think, is an image from the book that describes the psychological, theoretical understanding of depression very, very powerfully. So this is somebody you can see from the alarm clock has woken up at 3:20 in the morning. And you can see on the wall behind them what is running through their mind, which is what happens for people who are at risk for depression, who suffer from depression, is they can very quickly have access to this way of thinking very negatively, they can be very down on themselves, hopeless about the future. I'm no good, life isn't going to work out, I don't deserve this, why has this happened to me again? And this pattern of negative thinking can kind of coalesce into a spiraling downward spiral into depression very quickly. And Matthew Johnston uses the metaphor of a black dog coming to visit. And it's something he actually borrowed from Winston Churchill, which is the way Winston Churchill described his experience of depression to people around him. The black dog has come to visit. And so what we're doing in our lab, these are some of the people in my lab who are exploring this, is we're trying to unpack this mechanism. And I think it's very clear now that this is indeed the mechanism in depression, this access to negative thinking that can very quickly spiral and lead to a downward pattern into depression. And what we've now demonstrated in our lab is that that people in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy are developing the ability to see this pattern, to disengage from this pattern, and to develop a new perspective on their negative thinking. This is the black dog that's come to visit. This is not me. This is not true. This is not a reality. This is the depressive thinking that is a part of my depression. And in this particular study, led by Anne-Mai van der Velden, we're very proud of this piece of work. It's just about to be submitted. We're able to demonstrate that when we put people in a scanner, and people at risk for depression, when we put them in a scanner and we ask them to ruminate, to think negatively, we see their mood collapse exactly as we predict. But after they've been through an MBCT course, we see changes in their salience network. This is a very central network in in all of the networks that we use in being able to navigate our way through life. But it's one of the networks in which we determine what is relevant, what is salient, what is important. And what happens with rumination, of course, is people get caught and they lose sight of this is just thinking. And with the salience network, what we're suggesting is that people are able to decenter and stand back from their negative thinking. And this is mirrored in both psychological self-reports and in terms of activation in this particular network in the brain. And Matthew Johnston describes it in this way with his slide. So this is the same man who is now able to still, you see the black dog is still looking through the window, but Matthew Johnston is able to relate to this in a different way. And this is what we think is the mechanism that is at play. Now, I had a patient in one of my classes once, and he was called Di Cohen. And he wrote to me for many years after the end of the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy class and told me how he continued to use the skills in his life. He went on to develop bone cancer. He was a school teacher in his 50s. He had teenage daughters. He was married. And he said that what he had learned had helped him with his depression, helped him come off his medication. But when he developed bone cancer, he started to also be able to use the same skills in relation to the pain, in relation to his treatment journey, and in the latter part of his life, in relation to how he related to his children and to his wife and his family with compassion. And it led me and others to think, listen, what we're teaching with these programs are not programs just for depression. They're programs for life. They're programs for life. And what Christina and I spent a lot of time in our book thinking about is, what are these foundational skills that we're teaching? I think the first is the ability to pay attention, to focus. In the introduction to the whole session, we talked about all of the challenges to our attention from social media, from the anxiety of the pandemic and the greater access to information. Can we reclaim our attention? Can we retrain this incredible capacity that actually 50, 100 years ago, people probably were better able to do, particularly in countries like Bhutan. But I remember when I was working at the World Health Organization, I was struck in Thailand by how many of the general population would go to a monastery once a year to train their mind in skills like attention. That's the first. The second is the ability, as I've described already, to decenter. And once decentered, access a different way of knowing, maybe a more bodily, a wise, a new way of knowing. And from that place to step out of habits of behavior, habits of mind, to be able to choose how we respond to our inner landscape, but also the landscape of our relationships, the landscape of our community, the landscape of our world, the challenges that we face in our world around communication, around climate change, around inequality. Can we, if we are to prevent depression, move beyond treatment, the tip of the iceberg, even to beyond indicated prevention, to more universal primary prevention? Can we teach these skills in attention, in decentering, in responding, not reacting, and use the public health argument to move the whole population, not those just at very high risk, but the whole population towards greater mental health and greater flourishing? And that is the work that we are doing now in Oxford. And I want to just tell you about this trial, which is using a version of MBCT that Mark Williams and Danny Payman turned into a book called Mindfulness: Finding Peace in a Frantic World, published into translated into more than 35 languages, sold more than 1.5 million copies. And we have taken this curriculum and developed it into a face-to-face curriculum that can be taught to the general population. And this is a study of university students at Cambridge, as it happens. but it doesn't matter where it was. The curriculum was taught over 8 weeks to university students in Cambridge, a very stressful place to study. And it was a randomized controlled trial with a waitlist control. And what they were able to demonstrate was this. So the red bars are the control group, and this is the mindfulness training group. This is post-intervention, and this is during the very stressful exam period. And what they were able to demonstrate is that in the general population of university students in the course of a Cambridge term, learning mindfulness reduces distress, improves well-being, and these effects are particularly pronounced during the exam period. Isn't that an interesting idea, to take a group of young people and teach them these skills so they can apply them in early adulthood, and potentially not just so they can navigate those exams, but they can potentially use this throughout their lives. So we're just doing a large-scale project at the moment. We will be publishing the results in the next weeks and months. I'm not able to talk about them just yet, but we essentially recruited 28,000 children, 11 to 16, and we have been working with those children for the last 7 years, asking, does mindfulness training in schools improve mental health and well-being and prevent mental health problems? We did a systematic review suggesting that this would be a promising approach with small effect sizes, meaning we just do this small shift in the population rather than just work with people at high risk or indeed people who are already depressed. And this is the protocol for what we're doing. So it's a schools-based mindfulness training program taught by school teachers. And I'll just say something which I think is important by way of context. So we recruited 85 schools, and we assessed all the 28,000 children in the schools. And we looked at their mental health, first of all, and pretty typically, and I think this is pretty universal, about 18% of the children have significant mental health problems. 18%, that's quite high. And the second thing that we asked was, how much, so if you talk about, when I was talking about the sort of biopsychosocial influence on mental health, how much of the variance in young people's mental health was accounted for at these different levels? And I think this is a really important thing, a really important finding, and I suspect it's going to come out of our trial findings as well, is that actually this is one of the things we can learn from countries like Bhutan and actually China and other countries as well, is that a lot of the variance is not at the level of the child. It's not even at the level of the school. It's coming from levels of inequality, of deprivation, of the kind of challenges in the wider environment that children are facing. This is explaining a lot of the variance in mental health of young people. So if one were to think about it at a governmental level or at a policy level, that actually investing in the wider influences on young people's mental health is probably likely to pay off much more than trying to place the responsibility for mental health and flourishing in the young person's mind and body. Not to say that that isn't important to do, or indeed that we can't work through schools, but actually these influences on mental health come at a number of different levels. So when we conceptualized this work, that's the way we conceptualized it. We said, okay, so we're offering mindfulness training, but that is sitting in a wider context. Some of these schools are beautiful schools in really affluent neighborhoods. Some of them are in really tough neighborhoods where actually the levels of challenge and deprivation are very high. You need to think about that. You need to contextualize your work in that way. The second thing is, who's teaching this? We found real differences in the quality of the teaching. You have to really invest in the quality of the teaching. And what's the curriculum that you're teaching? It's not just a random curriculum. You have to think really carefully about the curriculum, the dose, and how well it's taught, and how well you're reaching the people that you want to reach. And I don't want to talk about the results of our study, but I can say from previous work that if you don't engage the children, well, if you don't first engage the teacher, and then engage the children, there is really very little point in doing this work. It's a bit, to use the pandemic analogy, if you develop a vaccine, and even if you make the vaccine available, if people don't take the vaccine, it's all a waste of time. If people don't practice the skills and use them in their lives, you're not going to see effects. And that is a really interesting challenge. How do you get young people to actually take these skills on board and use them in their day-to-day lives? So this actually just came out last week. It was a piece in the New Scientist. And again, if you like, I can make this article available as a PDF. It's behind a paywall, I'm afraid, this one. But it's a really nice overview of the field. It particularly looks at the area of pain. And what it's saying is that mindfulness is not a panacea, but alongside other proven approaches, it might be a really useful approach to think about in terms of a number of key areas: the prevention of depression, the promotion of mental health, working with pain. And I want to just finish on this, which is, and I'll just say by way of background, and I'm really thinking now about the next 50 years. And I remember when I was a child, sitting in the back of my father's car. Actually, I used to lie on the ledge in the back window on long journeys, and both my parents would be smoking in the front of the car, and none of us were wearing seatbelts. And there was no thought about secondary smoking for children. The idea of seatbelts wasn't in the ether. And of course now, I don't know about Bhutan, but certainly in many, many other countries, secondary smoking, seatbelts, safety of cars, safety on the roads is absolutely in the mainstream. If somebody were to smoke in front of children now, people would go, that's not cool. And I kind of hope that the world can catch up with what when I was working at the World Health Organization in the 1990s, early 1990s, I saw lots of evidence of this in Bhutan, and Christina Feldman writes about this in the foreword to her book. Can some of these practices, these psychological, meditative practices, come into the mainstream in the same ways that diet, exercise are in the mainstream now? Can we collectively bring these more into the mainstream? And I think that's one of the challenges for the next 50 years. So that 50 years from now, people have the same thought about mental hygiene, mental health, mental flourishing that we have about diet and exercise. But I want to just finish with this one point, which is, I think we always need to think about how can we make the work that we do accessible. And MBCT as a group-based intervention is a fantastic intervention, but it has to be taught by trained therapists. It's taught in groups, it's taught in the healthcare system. That's never going to touch the whole iceberg of depression. So if you think about it as a sort of funnel of the whole population, how do you bring the whole population into a dialogue and an engagement around mental health and the promotion of mental health? And certainly around the world, digital mental health apps have introduced mindfulness to, I did the maths on 3 apps, Insight Timer, Calm, and Headspace. They have introduced around the world mindfulness now to, I think, over 400 million people. That's a lot of people. Then as you come down the funnel, I think I mentioned this book has now been sold over 1.5 million times. As you come down the funnel, things like that can take people further. They can learn more. And then these programs like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and then programs that we're developing for the general population, the Finding Peace program, but also a new program, MBCT for Life, can take people further. And then people who want to go further yet can go on more intensive retreats or teacher training. And this is down this end of the curriculum. So I want to just end with this sort of invitation, if you like, of can we envisage, as I was just pointing to, a world without the devastating effects of depression? This is an understandable and a treatable condition where people enjoy greater mental health and well-being and are resourced with these core skills of attention, decentering, responsiveness, imbued with discernment and wisdom and compassion to meet the challenges of the next 50 years. I've made available a set of resources freely that people can access if they'd like to learn more about mindfulness and MBCT. And I want to just end by thanking all of my colleagues and funding sources for the work. All of the work that I've described that's come out of my lab has not been my individual work. It's almost always been a work of collaboration and co-working. And I want to acknowledge my collaborators and co-investigators and students, and also the people who Mr. Chencho announced have funded my work over the years. And thank you all for your attention. So hopefully now there'll be some chance for some dialogue and some discussion.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor William. In a very short span of time, you have given us a lot to digest. I will not attempt to summarize whatever you have said, but you have very succinctly laid out to all the audience what is the scale of the problem of mental health in the world, what really is depression, what is the real problem, that it is not an isolated one dimensional problem, but more a biopsychosocial problem that needs a very innovative solution. In that you have through a lot of research and rigor of experimentation, you have come up with the MBCT tool, which is more of a mix of science and ancient wisdom. And you have also given us the confidence of the efficacy of the methodology, in that it has compared very well with conventional tools like use of antidepressant. And now, as you have mentioned, how you have been able to put this into practice by coming up with very rigorous programs, and also spreading the knowledge to the rest of the world by mainstreaming this into the clinical guidelines of various health services. And then ultimately you have also touched at not only using this MBCT as a tool only for treating depression and mental health issues, but also to make it a ubiquitous tool for handling all kinds of life experiences. And then not only as a treatment, but also as a early detection and preventive tool to identify if people are susceptible to this kind of illnesses. So therefore, I would like to now open the floor to question answer. And before opening that, I would like to thank Professor and make my own comment that ultimately what I would like to wish Professor is that the aspiration that you made towards the end of your presentation to make this available through all kinds of channels, like digital use of technology, use of printed books and articles, and then ultimately people who have the means and the access to join your dedicated programs, so that ultimately people, the 300 million odd people, and then ultimately about 1 billion people out of the 7 billion world population that might at one point of time in their life might go through this kind of issues, will ultimately get to live flourishing lives with compassion, happiness, and ultimately as productive citizens, family members, children, so that ultimately we get to operate from a basis of awareness and not from a very narrow and shaky base of negative self-talk and negative emotions. So as you make this very ambitious aspiration to serve the citizens of the world, I wish and pray that your dream come true, and wish you success in achieving your aspiration. So with this, I would like to now open the floor for question answer with Professor. And if I may have the opportunity of requesting Tashukarma Ura, if you may have anything to add before I open it to the rest of the audience.
No, I do not have anything, just to say how wonderful the talk was, and we all enjoyed. So I leave it here.
Last, thank you. Last, Tio Vachin Professor Lu, Tio Vasuna Sishunila. So if there is no one asking question right now, just in the interest of time, there is a question from
Dorji Daddil was raising his hand.
Last Tashola. Please go ahead now.
Plus, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor, for the very wonderful presentation. It was really highly informative and inspirational. But I just was intrigued with your remarks in the very beginning. Professor, you said that maybe it will take next 100 years for the, I'm very related, the GNH to become a norm in this world. So I thought that was quite intriguing, and mainly in terms of timeline, very, very long, I think very far. But in your presentation, of course, your timeline, basically you are referring to coming down to 50 years. So I was just thinking whether you have something more to add on to that remarks of yours.
I do think a deep bow to the leadership and the people of Bhutan, because in the rest of the world, different forces impact on mental health and well-being. So just to speak from what I know, which is right now my work with young people in a number of countries. In this country, there are many, many pressures on young people which are not coming from a top-down commitment to gross domestic happiness. They're coming from academic achievement. They're coming from a place of fear of having enough resources to live. They're coming from pressures from social media and various for young women, for example. I've raised 2 young daughters, for their bodies to look a very particular way. And there's a lot of pressure on young women for them to look and appear a certain way. So these are these other pressures that I think young people face that impact on their mental health and their well-being. And I think that was maybe the point I was trying to make about there are multiple influences, and just pragmatically, you know, industry, large companies that, you know, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, these are major companies that indirectly shape people's mental health and well-being. And I think the more they come on board with understanding the importance of flourishing mental health and well-being, the more this will become a realizable aspiration. I think that would be the only additional comment I would have. I think I sometimes remind myself not to be naive. These are very real forces that impact on people. And so that's why I kind of try to make the point that it's a biopsychosocial problem and likely to be a biopsychosocial solution. But, you know, companies like Google have tried to prioritize mental capital and human flourishing. So there, I think, are good examples of this happening in other ways in other places. I don't know if that's what you were pointing to yourself. I'd be interested in your own reflections on your own question.
Thank you, Professor. There is a question from Professor Sabina. I would like to read it out for you. She says, Professor, you have given such an inspiring lecture and encouraged us all to learn the MBCT. But how do we do in Bhutan learn those techniques? And also, we are blessed with many highly accomplished meditation masters in Bhutan. How do their teachings relate to what you discuss? Will their approaches to mind training and mind control and compassion also work to fight depression and the other difficult health states?
So the list of resources, Sabina, that I sent around, and I'm very happy to send around, includes a section answering your question. So there is a section in there saying, here are some free resources if you would like to learn more about mindfulness. So that's the first part of your question. There are various websites, including our own various online resources. The second part of your question, I don't know that I feel qualified to answer, and there might be people on the Zoom call today better qualified to answer it than me. But what I do think is very interesting, and I'm no expert in this, but there will be people here who are more expert than me, is that for thousands of years, if you go back and read the Pali Canon, there is this idea that the mind has these different facets, these different aspects, and different trainings train these different facets and these different aspects. So attention, for example, can be trained in ancient traditions in multiple different ways. And I think in a way, these older traditions, understandings and practices, and psychology is 120 years old. So we're just sort of catching up. I mean, in a sense, we've learned a lot about perception and attention. And what Christina and I were trying to do was beginning to match those two onto each other. But yes, I think the contemplative traditions, the Buddhist traditions, the teachings within Bhutan are incredibly sophisticated understandings and practices in working with different mind states, working with different emotional states. And I think, gosh, I feel so incredibly excited about how much there is still to know and understand about the human mind and how to unlock, well, first understand and then unlock the human mind. You know, the brain is one of the most complex organs that we've only just started to scratch the surface of. And so I think with this, we're just beginning on this journey. I think this is such a fascinating journey that we're on about how to train this extraordinary faculty of the human mind. It's really only now that, you know, if you think about human history, where people's concern has been more survival, and it's really only now, it feels, in the arc of human history that this is particularly coming out of the pandemic. And as Mr. Chencho referred to at the beginning, the world has become more universal. That's one of the things that I have found so amazing about this pandemic, is that we started teaching online in the first week of lockdown in this country, which was March 2020. And at the moment, that class on a Wednesday night has got 1,800 to nearly 2,000 people joining on Zoom every week. And they are coming from every corner of the world. And that maybe is one of the good things that's going to come out of this pandemic, a more kind of universal coming together around shared challenges, including, Sabina, your question about, how can the mind be unlocked to just to be happy, but to actually to meet the challenges of the next 50 years. And the challenges are challenges, I think, that we're facing not just within countries, but around the world. I hope that begins, Sabina, to answer some of your questions, but great questions.
Thank you, Professor. There is one question from Tasho. Tasho, Dr. Sugam Tenzin. Please go ahead, Tasho.
Thank you very much. And also thank you very much for inviting me for this important workshop. I have basically three questions, three areas to where I would like to make an intervention. Number one is on the etiology of the condition of depression. You mentioned it is biological, socio-psychological, hormonal, a lot of other things. What I would like to know is that this depression, does it happen more to people with compassion, with more intelligence, those who are more intelligent, more sensitive, empathetic, or does it happen to other type of people? So this is one area. And another thing is that I think depression is proportional to personally, I feel it's proportional to the advancement, the complexity of life. The more simple our life was, the less depressions and anxiety and a lot of other things were less. And now we have more when the life becomes complex, everything. And we are not only worried about what is happening to us and things around us, but we are worried about what is happening all over the world. So that is the first thing. Second is on your efficacy of mindfulness. Of course, now you mentioned about mindfulness as a panacea. I think there is no doubt about the fact that mindfulness has a definite place in treating the depression. But the thing is that now the mindfulness is also a kind of a thing. It is taken all over the world. It's a $1 million industry where mindfulness is used in 100 ways, and it's also used for different things. For example, I was told once upon a time that there is also a meditation for James Bond 007 who has a license to kill. So mindfulness per se is definitely a very efficient way of controlling the depressions and other things. But then it has also been utilized the way that pervasively it has been commercialized, and a lot of things. We have to be careful about that one also. And the third thing is that when it comes to future in Bhutan, as Sabina mentioned, and in Bhutan, I think our ancient wisdom of mindfulness is locked in the monasteries. So it is there's so much of reluctance to bring this into the classrooms. They think this is very sacred, that we should approach this only after learning a lot of other Buddhist philosophies, but it's not true. I think mindfulness and the steps of mindfulness, there are many, like samatha, vipassana, and a lot of other things. So I think it is very important that we bring this wisdom and bring it to the classrooms, because otherwise, if you think that this is only for those who go for higher retreat, then its usefulness, the wisdom that is the Buddhist wisdom, will not be applied properly. So these are the three things that I would like to mention. But in anxiety, when it comes to etiology, I want to know from the professor as to what kind of people, besides social, the complexity, modernization, other things, what kind of people are more susceptible to depression, and what kind of people are more resilient to the depression. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I counted 4 questions there, but let me just work through them. So I think the first, Thank you, first of all, great questions. In terms of who is more vulnerable to depression, probably the first thing I'd say is women. Rates of, and that difference emerges in adolescence, and it's at a rate of 2 to 3 to 1. So women are more prone to depression, and I think some people say men express the same distress in a different way, often through substance misuse. I think that's not quite what you're asking. You're asking more about kind of dimensions of personality or human functioning. I think the one that comes through the shorthand word is sometimes neuroticism. I think you use the word sensitivity. I think people who are, their mood is more labile, they are more sensitive. The way I think of this, and I love this metaphor of these folks are a bit more like orchids. And in a really good environment and in a really good upbringing, they can flourish and become beautiful like orchids. But you put people like that in adversity and in trauma, they're destroyed by it. And there is some evidence that people who are more sensitive in good environments will flourish, but in adversity won't. And there are other people who are more like, I can't think of a Bhutanese natural example, but here, you know, daffodils, you can put them, not daffodils, certain types of flowers, you can put them dandelions, you can put them anywhere and they'll flourish. And I think there's something about sensitivity and neuroticism, but certainly gender is one of the best predictors of depression. You asked about changing rates of depression over time. And yes, there are big epidemiological studies suggesting that the rates of depression in cohorts seem to be going up. But people are wondering whether that's real or whether that's also about reporting and identification. I think it's probably about both. I think people are better able to recognize it, are better able to report it, but I think that's exactly as you expressed. I think it probably is to a degree real. I think your final point, sorry, your third point was around mindfulness is everywhere. I think of mindfulness when I define it as being a bit like defining wisdom or beauty or love. These are not easy words to define, but I always include in my definition of mindfulness ethics, intentionality and ethics. That mindfulness is not mindfulness if it does not have the compass of an ethical framework and a set of intentionality. So if you are teaching a sniper like 007, the ability to pay attention so that he can shoot more accurately, that's not mindfulness. That's attentional training. If you are teaching attention and some version of mindfulness just to make money, that's not mindfulness, because you've stripped the ethical dimension out of it. So for me, the definition of mindfulness includes a dimension of ethics, of intention. And in my work, that intention is around the prevention of depression and the creation of human flourishing. And with Bhutan and within the Dharma, it is a particular ethical dimension. Now, your final question was about monasteries, and I'm not qualified to speak to this, and I know how very, very sensitive this is. Of course I do. But I have such respect for my colleague and friend, Christina Feldman. And the number of times I have heard her asked versions of this question, and she always just brushes it aside with the following response: I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in helping to understand the human mind and unlock understanding that will create human happiness, reduce suffering, and create the potential for human potential. And people say, well, look, there's this philosophical aspect or this religious aspect. I really want to ask you about that. She goes, no, look, I'm not interested in that. I know she could speak about it. I know she understands it. I know she understands all the issues, but she knows that that is an elephant trap. That is an elephant trap that will take her into a particular direction. And she stays focused, as we did in the book, on trying to create the understanding. Those primary school kids are not interested in the answer to that question. They want to learn, they want to be happy, they want to become productive citizens in the world and to lead good lives. So that's Christina's response to that question. I had the great privilege once of I was doing a speaking tour in the States, and I was in Boston. And in the morning, I spoke at Harvard, and I put on my suit and I was speaking. And that evening, I was at the Insight Meditation Society in Cambridge, which was founded by Joseph Goldstein, I think. And it's been going for many, many years. And I was sitting on a huge cushion on a platform with a meditation bell, which was about 3 feet long. And people were cross-legged on the ground. I gave the same talk. And somebody asked me the last question of the evening. I was tired. Somebody asked me the question, said, I think you've misunderstood. The point of the Dharma is not to improve well-being. And then he started to talk about the point of the Dharma was something else. And he threw me. I'll be honest, he threw me. So I phoned Christina up and I said, Christina, how should I have responded to that question? She said, nonsense. Of course, that's the point of the Dharma, to increase well-being. And so it's just, I love Christina's pragmatism, if you like, her pragmatism. And I think we can go down these elephant traps. But, you know, as I understand it, in Bhutan, you are interested in gross domestic happiness. And that how does one achieve that, right? It's a great question. I don't know the answer, and I hope I have not offended anybody with my answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful answer.
Director Chencho, unmute पे होवे.
Dasho Zangle is raising his hand. Dasho Zangle Dukpa.
Lasla. Limbo, the floor is yours. La. Unmute nang obela. Limbo unmute nang obela.
Katila minuwa dani.
Tupchila, sumla.
Tupchila.
Tupchila.
Can you hear me?
Yes, la. Please go ahead now.
Thank you, Professor. Very enlightening. Two straight questions. Number one, you know, as social scientist, where do you see your role, you know, in this information age, artificial intelligence, big data, etc.? Where do you see your role there? You know, in addressing such problems, social problems, psychological problems, emotional problems, or spiritual problems? Number two, yes, I'm very happy to hear that you are involving decision makers, the government officials, parliamentarians. Very good. Now, there's one, you know, like Professor Norman Pele, you know, power of positive thinking, trying to bring in people together, physician, psychologists, psychiatrists, preachers, coming together to address this issue. And how do you see this kind of collective approach, you know, from different backgrounds to address such issue like mental health? Thank you.
Yes, Professor.
It's very great questions. And I think my response is to both questions in that sense is the same. You know, well, it's very interesting because actually my mindfulness practice is what provides me with my ethical compass. That's the first thing to say. So when I reflect on questions like yours, very often the answer comes from my own meditation cushion. You know, often I will take these kinds of problems to my meditation cushion, and I will be clearer at the end of a period of sitting, or be that one session, or over a course of weeks or months or even years. I see my primary, if I'm honest, I see my primary job as, in my science, asking important questions and then reporting the results responsibly. So I will give you an example. So the trial I described, where we compared mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT, with antidepressants, the question was, would MBCT be superior to antidepressants? Because we had some pilot data suggesting that it might be. And it wasn't. And if I'm honest, when I first saw the results, I was disappointed. And I took that to my meditation cushion. I thought, you know, my ego wanted to spin the results. But my ethical compass said that your job as a scientist is to report this responsibly. And I think that is the first part to my answer to your question. I don't know about Bhutan, but I do know about the rest of the world. And I think what has happened in the last 2 years is that the place of science and the way in which scientists and policymakers interact has changed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think before that, there was, particularly from certain countries in the world, a tendency to dismiss or minimize science because it wasn't politically expedient to do so. And what's very interesting is when the world was facing the pandemic, all of a sudden the people who created vaccines and who understood public health became very popular. Governments said, we're not interested in getting rid of our public health department. We desperately need your help right now. And the vaccines group here in Oxford, donors pumped millions and millions of dollars into the vaccines group to help them create the vaccines that are now vaccinating the world. And I personally, to answer your second question, I think the problems of the world will require the most extraordinary collaboration between entrepreneurs, policymakers, and scientists. So when Mr. Chencho was talking about, you know, the solution to mental health is going to require digital mental health, healthcare systems, entrepreneurs, the private sector, the public sector, scientists, I think that's absolutely right. You know, the biggest introduction to mindfulness in the world right now is coming from entrepreneurs in the digital space. And I think that's great, but also problematic because it's a bit light on science. And actually, the solutions to these problems, as we've just seen with the pandemic, you know, the Oxford vaccine was a collaboration between AstraZeneca, a pharmaceutical company, and a very prestigious vaccine science group. And then governments around the world have engaged with AstraZeneca around the distribution, around the purchase, and so on. So I think the biggest problems in our world will require collaborations between those different sectors. And often they don't want to collaborate, but the pandemic has forced people to collaborate. And I wonder whether the same will happen with climate change. And I think there'll be other things like COVID-19 around the corner. And so hopefully we won't forget how much good has come out of that collaboration. And I suspect the same might happen with mental health. I really hope it does. Yeah. Great question.
So thank you, Professor. So as much as we would like to learn from you, we are also acutely aware of time limitations. So I would like to ask you one question from the chat box. So here is a question from Tashunyim Sri. His question is, even as we engage into different approaches to overcoming the issues related to mental health, we see increasing young populace victimized by the mental health issues. Where do you see the biggest disconnect?
I'm not sure I understand the piece about disconnect.
I I think he is trying to mean we are making a lot of efforts into resolving mental health related issues, but at the same time we see increasing young population falling victims to mental health related issues. So where do you see the biggest disconnect?
It's interesting. I don't know that I know the answer to this, but I think the question is a great one. It's if we want to engage children, adolescents, young adults, we have to ask ourselves the question. We have to ask them, what do you connect with? How can you connect? What resonates with you? What's the best way of communicating with you? I think our own data is suggesting just for adults to say this is the solution and to put it into schools, that won't work. I think we need to look very carefully at what children and young people themselves are engaging with, what resonates for them, what's important to them. And I think we know for adolescents, for example, it's peer groups. You know, if a peer group says the predominant narrative or what is important is this, and then a school comes in and says that the peer group for a group of adolescents will always win out. So I think at primary school age, it's parents and family and the primary school teacher. In secondary school age, it's peer groups, and in young adults, so how can we connect in those different places with people in different ways? I think for primary school children, it's indirectly through the parents, through the teachers. For secondary school, we have to find a way of reaching the whole peer group. So the whole peer group values doing something. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's very easy to get this wrong. I think it's very easy to get this wrong and to think that we know the answers. But in numerous studies now, we've shown that if you just throw things at schools and at children and you don't stop to ask yourself, how do I connect and get them to engage with this? It's a waste of time. So it's a really great question, and I'm not sure that we know the answer just yet. But I think there probably is good learning from other areas. I'm thinking about other social emotional education areas, but I'd like to spend more time thinking about that question. It's a great question to end on. How do we connect with people to get them to really want to onboard this learning? Yeah.
So thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time. It has been a very enlightening talk on a subject that is very critical to our own existence, flourishing, and happiness. And I personally have learned a lot from this very short interaction with you. I think this is just the beginning of a very long interaction and relationship with Oxford University in general, and in particular with Professor yourself. And I would like to thank you for all the effort and time that you have spared for us. And I am sure our esteemed audiences have also learned a great deal from your presentation and talk today. And with Oxford and Professor and with your supporters leading this initiative, we would like to wish you success in teaching the skill of MBCT to as many people as possible in the world, so that ultimately we all gain competency and become skillful in entertaining and befriending the black dog without being subservient to the dog and without being fearful of the dog. So with this, I would like to, on behalf of all the audience here, I would like to once again thank Professor. I would like to also thank Gizin, and I would like to thank Tasha Karmura for making this possible. So thank you so much. And I would like to now formally close this virtual seminar. Thank you so much, Professor. Tima ngachira Buddhist participants gi tenela mapat Professor de Chensi Iru Nabu Sundena Anibe Junigi te Pasu Terkapa Tabu Jeni Mimis Asire Sunderena Nigi Tuje Bachin another 10-15 minutes teaching a chero CBS ki Katule Tabura deve Shaptopinam Besishunila.
Exactly, that's sir. So if there are any discussions and reflections to be made, so I will still keep the Zoom call open for about 15 to 20 minutes now.
Minor announcement of major events. On 2nd July, we will have Mindset Zoom talk by Jürgen Nadler, based on his PhD. And in the middle of July, we will have a fascinating presentation drawing from the 3 biographies of Tsangpa Jare by Professor C.J. Kumagai, who has been working on it for last 5 years, he and his team. On 22nd July, around on the same time, at the same time, we will be we will have the privilege of another 1.5 hour lecture on the history of Tantra, G, by Dr. Emma Ramos, with illustrated presentation. She is an authority on Tantra, straddling both Hinduism and Buddhism, especially the Vajrayana Buddhism. So please look forward to this Zoom talks for July, but it will not end with this tool. We will go on throughout the year. So may I revert back to Dr. Chencho?
Last Tasho an information share bena mekatchi sishunila. Tetari Cherinam to Miss Jemitsudi ngacha anik nalo Jemitsube Iru ngache Limbo Zangle Cho Telen Tash Dr. Somethings in Disu. After a long time, Jenny Kokap Top Be Jenny Kokap Jamchi Top Mase She Je Suntini Kokap Nishara Top Be Torolok Sachi Hisang Satan Sishunila.
Dasho Sonam wants to intervene.
Last la.
Kadichela. Tachinga kolu shumi dekale chidi ani ngachigi mindfulness. That darenawa zambling na kate ani mindfulness kulujulab mebal. Ngachara kale bewachin dembang nyawar shakba semidi meba. Te nyamlen se chi dele dembang nyawar shakba se chi te dinale besnale dele ru chakchinda zokchinge diswe sosubi. Ta ngachigi lamlu dina tab madu di gachimo se bet bewachin. Ngachi ani dembar ngewa shakpagi lu de labi galera kaira nam tu zaumela. Datsa iru sheda iru gati iru pa di gati datu dise. Dite dit datu dim luji iremens. Ta ngachara ani Roma gachilo Theravada disuna ta de bet bewachin dasana zuchi ra tangbara ro nyamnen gachilo dembar ngewa shakpagi gochubi ise shunmi la. The zamling nale dato catchu nale catchu lashu yuvi nale dato ani tekna tan ge kogi tekna tan gi kogi gochu misul gochu debate about miracles of mindfulness lo ansu debate bet bewachin ani di ngachi gi pecha gochu bi ganlara chugu ganlara ani achichi di ten debota tasagi lusube mendere bet beshiro ani di ngachari shungi sijuji zumbe education system na te temor ngewa shakpati achichi gochu ni chi yud bet bewachin te diginam sem pen se normal te da depression di phasha kachere beder bet beshiro takbar digi ngachara gara calm zone mosla calm zone compassionate zone focus zone and productive la kachira berenam so productive zone digi nangkinale te ngachi view world view in the bet beshiro kachigi view in the bet beshiro disya gara zone di anime te ngachi te da ta gende achichi namra beder bet beshiro ani shuni chalachi dikchi te naishi ngachi ani value gi committee nale ngachi ani nation disulu gara ani achichi dambar ngewa shapachi achichi gotsunichi ta dato GNH ki inro CBS ki inro te da education system ki inro kachigire beder bet gotsu bi gale te dani dambar ngewa shapati ngachi gi lobsunal ma gotsu be bet ochin lejumon me es no ni la ta dim member chin ani lejume dachi khogiro namsan lejume dimension of intent semichi ko lejume sui di mendbet beochin dato tiru boom boom be sai be zomi dollar di ru ani use bedi te dia gumi jumi be beshnale tel lam kembu disuge chijele pa ani ten tiru zowi tele university national be namesame degree that pagi america gi university she bomb shiginale grosser tiru zome revenue highest gachina zome so chani temper ngewa shapanal zome mindfulness nal zome it should not remain just as money making pervasive international sensational kind of a thing. It should be made useful. It's ancient wisdom la the thandralat beochin eastern wisdom ya ani bet beuda te ani appropriately use beniti che khabadsugi beshnale macharegi lamlu nana chu di be ja chichibe chu di bet beochi dime te di membachin dropa chige hablo lecture tani chida tele ani tiru zoni chi university suna ani be zoni chi di bet beochi di ani chigateni jamchi di bet beochi di mitu upse de shunibe ani di achichi kansan chi yese junila kadiche Chencho.
Last show last la tashu isumin this machegi to chap beta tare ngadarim bochigi kashuna beshim daleru sherigi nalu juche lamlu disu juche na chajung disu juche na bodalo tani disu machegi phashuni kokap da te ani juche asri zeni gi kokap tu se shuni la ni galunga chigi te junglo beru te pa education gi kesho sulu beru machiga tule ani su note be figures shuni la last la debo watching ta Jimitsuki kane suni me brochi watching teta professor di chensei tanga cherna jumi karalo tari dinalu chamato ba chenna tengara gutamba anisumgi tele rimchi moderate se ta inke nalu moderate so me zonhana lu tigi chi nam samchi nem matop inru godin thabni zumchi indo mon me tan nalu nam sami nyamnyong miru te chamatoni te shule pha that tizum toro kokap thobashin te nyamnyong sapchi thobmi gi te dilu tasho karma rolu te kokap tizum nam lu kari che shuni da shikha te ta karalo tari anna chenam dilu kari che shuni la